A gilded cage and a boy's escape. The floor-to-ceiling windows of the Caldwell penthouse framed the city like a painting, each gleaming skyscraper a brushstroke on the canvas of wealth. From this height, everything looked perfect, clean, orderly, shimmering under the soft haze of twilight. It was a city shaped by the hands of men like Randall Caldwell, and his only son, Luke, was expected to inherit that grip. Inside the dining room, the air felt heavier than the imported marble that lined the floor. The tables stretched the length of the room, an obscene display of wealth for a household of only two. Randall sat at the far end, cutting into a perfectly seared filet mignon, the knife slicing through meat as easily as he sliced through corporate competition. Luke, at the other end, sat before his own untouched plate, the colors of the food too vibrant, too artfully arranged to feel real. His grip tightened on the fork, fingertips whitening as his father's voice filled the silence, a voice that didn't need to be raised to be feared. "You've been distracted," Randall said, not looking up from his plate. "That isn't acceptable." Luke said nothing. Silence was safer. "You're my son," Randall continued, dabbing his mouth with a linen napkin. "You're not some naive child who can afford to waste time on sentiment. The world doesn't respect kindness, Luke. It respects power." Luke's gaze drifted toward the window, where the city pulsed with life below. The honking cars, the flickering neon signs, the swirl of strangers living lives unbound by boardrooms and balance sheets. That world felt infinitely more real than the polished sterility of this dining room. "There's a board meeting next week," Randall said, already rising, as though the conversation, or lecture, was complete. "You'll be there. It's time you learned what it takes to sit in my chair." "Yes, sir," Luke mumbled, his voice mechanical, detached from the boy inside who was screaming for air. When the dining room door whispered shut behind his father, Luke exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The room felt larger without Randall in it, but no less suffocating. The weight of expectations hung over Luke's head, like a chandelier made of iron chains. He needed to get out. 15 minutes later, Luke's sneakers whispered against the plush carpet of the back hallway, a path the house staff used when they wanted to avoid being seen. The surface elevator was a lifeline, a portal between two worlds, the cold luxury above and the chaos of the streets below. The guard at the lobby barely glanced at him. In jeans and a hoodie, Luke was just another face. Out here, the Caldwell name meant nothing. The city welcomed him with a breath of diesel and fried food, the sense of real life. Music spilled from an open doorway. A street vendor shouted about hot dogs, and a child laughed as they chased a runaway balloon. Luke melted into the noise, the anonymity grounding him in ways his father's empire never could. It was near the convenience store where he first saw her, a woman huddled against the brick wall, wrapped in layers of mismatched clothing. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, trembling with cold or maybe something else. Her face was worn, the kind of face you pass 100 times in a city like this without ever really seeing. Luke had walked past her before. Everyone had. But tonight, something made him pause. Maybe it was the way her shoulders curled inward, like she was trying to make herself smaller. Maybe it was the way her fingers traced patterns on the concrete, tiny invisible shapes drawn in desperation. Or maybe it was just the way the streetlight framed her, not as a faceless vagrant, but as a person. The store's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Luke stepped inside, grabbing a sandwich, a bottle of water, and a thick blanket from the emergency supply shelf. The clerk rang it up without comment, used to teenagers with platinum cards buying out of guilt or boredom. When he returned, the woman didn't look up as he knelt beside her. "It's cold," Luke said softly, placing the blanket across her lap. The sandwich and water sat beside her, untouched. Slowly, her head lifted, and for the first time, Luke saw her eyes. Dark, deep, filled with something that made his stomach twist. Recognition flickered across her face, too brief to understand. But they're all the same. "You've got your daddy's eyes, don't you?" she whispered. The words hit like a physical blow, knocking the air from Luke's lungs. He froze, the city noise falling away into silence. "What did you say?" he asked, voice hoarse. Her trembling fingers reached toward his face, stopping just short of touching him. Her gaze softened with something Luke couldn't name. Grief, longing, regret. "I know those eyes," she said. "I'd know them anywhere." Luke stumbled back, his heart hammering painfully in his chest. "My mother is dead," he said, more to himself than to her. "She died when I was a baby." The woman's lips trembled into something that was half smile, half sob. "That's what he told you," she whispered. "That's what he wanted you to believe." Luke turned, his mind spinning. The marble floors of the penthouse might have been miles away, but his father's voice was suddenly in his ear, cold and certain. "Your mother couldn't handle the responsibility of being a Caldwell." He fled, footsteps pounding against the pavement, the city lights blurring into streaks of neon and shadow. That night, sleep was a stranger. Luke lay awake in his immaculate bedroom, the silence pressing against him like a second skin. Could it be true? Could the woman outside a convenience store, the woman the world ignored, be the mother he was told had died before his first birthday? And if she was, why had Randall Caldwell buried her memory beneath a lie? Dawn brought no answers, only a hollow ache where certainty used to live. There was only one way to know for sure. The next evening, Luke returned to the store, his heart pounding as he scanned the sidewalk. She was there, in the same spot, her hands folded in her lap, her breath curling into the cold air. This time, Luke didn't hesitate. He knelt beside her, his throat dry, his fingers curling into fists against his knees. "Who are you?" he asked. She looked at him, eyes filled with ghosts and memories. "I'm your mother," she said, voice soft but certain. The words cracked something open inside him. A dam, a wall, a lifetime of lies. "Prove it," he whispered. Helen, the name she'd given herself when her memory returned in shattered fragments, reached into the folds of her coat, pulling out a worn photograph. The edges were frayed, the colors faded, but the image was clear, a younger version of her holding a baby boy with wide, curious eyes. Luke's eyes. His hand shook as he took the photo, tracing the image with trembling fingers. The walls of his world shifted, tilting on their foundations. The Caldwell name meant something his father had always said, but maybe, just maybe, the truth meant more. And for the first time, Luke wasn't afraid to find out. Truth beneath the marble. The air inside the Caldwell penthouse felt heavier than usual, like every inch of luxury had been soaked in secrets, and now the walls themselves could no longer contain them. Luke stood outside his father's office, his knuckles white as they clenched at his sides. His heart pounded so loudly in his ears it drowned out the soft hum of the central air system. The doorknob felt cold beneath his palm as he pushed the heavy oak door open, stepping inside without knocking, something he'd never dared to do before. Randall Caldwell sat behind his desk, perfectly still. The only motion came from the swirling amber liquid in his glass, the ice cubes clicking softly as they shifted. His father didn't look up immediately. His eyes were fixed on the city beyond the windows, the empire he had built and controlled. Everything Randall saw, he owned. Or so he thought. "You lied to me." Luke's voice was quiet, but each word was a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through the silence. Randall didn't flinch. Slowly he turned, setting his glass down with precise care. His expression was unreadable, the mask he wore to board meetings and press conferences perfectly in place. About what? Luke's fingers curled into fists so tight his nails dug into his palms. About her. Randall's brow twitched, just slightly, a crack in the armor, but his voice remained smooth. "She's dead." "No," Luke said, stepping closer. "She's not. I saw her. Outside the convenience store by Lexington. She knew me. She remembered me." Randall's fingers tightened around the armrest of his chair. "She's no one. he said, voice still calm but with a thin thread of steel woven through it. She's been no one for a long time. No one. Luke's voice cracked, the fury bubbling up now, too wild to control. She's my mother. She was weak. Randall's tone turned colder, sharper. Weak people destroy everything around them. I spared you from that. Luke shook his head, disbelief thick in his throat. You didn't spare me from anything. You stole her from me. Randall rose slowly, his height imposing, but for the first time in his life, Luke didn't shrink back. Do you have any idea what she would have done to you? Randall's voice was low, dangerous. She was unstable. She would have dragged you into poverty, into mediocrity. You were born to be more. Luke took another step forward, the polished floor cold against his bare feet. You don't get to decide that. Randall's eyes narrowed, the mask slipping just slightly. I decide everything. The words sent a chill down Luke's spine, not just because of the arrogance, but because it was true. His entire life had been curated, shaped, and boxed into a perfect package by the man standing in front of him. Not anymore, Luke said, voice shaking but firm. Randall exhaled through his nose, the sound slow and controlled. I built this life for you. Everything you have. Your education, your future, your name, it all comes from me. And if you think for 1 second you can throw it all away for a broken woman living on the street, you're a fool. Luke's stomach churned with disgust. She's not broken. You broke her. The silence that followed was like a living thing, wrapping itself around both of them, choking the air from the room. Luke's chest heaved, his heart racing with adrenaline. For the first time, Randall Caldwell didn't have control, and he knew it. She loved me, Luke said, softer now, the anger giving way to something raw and painful. She sang to me. She held me when I cried. I don't remember much, but I remember that. Randall's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. I'm leaving, Luke said. Randall's gaze sharpened. If you walk out that door, you're no longer my son. Luke swallowed hard. The words hit harder than he expected, but not hard enough to stop him. I'd rather have nothing with her than everything with you. Randall stepped closer, the scent of expensive cologne and whiskey filling the space between them. Don't romanticize her. She's nothing but a ghost. Luke stepped back toward the door. She's my mother. Randall didn't stop him, not physically, but his voice followed Luke as he turned the knob. You'll come crawling back. The door closed behind him with a soft click, but to Luke, it sounded like the slamming of a cell door, except this time, he was stepping out of the prison, not into it. The night air hit Luke like a slap, cold and sharp, cleansing him of the penthouse's suffocating sterility. His feet moved faster than his thoughts, carrying him down streets that felt both familiar and foreign. His hands trembled as he shoved them into the pockets of his hoodie, the same hoodie he'd worn the night he found her. Helen. The name felt strange in his mind, like a word long buried beneath years of dust. But it was her. The woman who had held him, who had whispered lullabies into his ear when the world was small and safe. She was still there, curled on the sidewalk with her back against the wall, her face half hidden behind her scarf. She didn't look up as he approached, lost in the rhythm of the city, in the cold and the hunger and the 1,000 tiny humiliations that made up her life. Luke knelt beside her, his breath misting in the air. Mom. The word came out soft, uncertain, but it was enough. Her head snapped up, her eyes locking onto his, wide with disbelief and something else, hope so fragile it might break if touched. Lucas. He nodded, the knot in his throat too tight for words. Her hands trembled as they reached for his face, fingertips brushing his cheek, tracing the contours she'd once known by heart. My baby, she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. My beautiful boy. Luke's chest ached, the years of silence and separation crashing over him like a wave. I'm here, he said, voice breaking. I'm not going anywhere. She pulled him into her arms, her grip desperate, and fierce, as though she could anchor herself to him, as though holding him might erase all the years they'd lost. Her body shook with sobs, and Luke held her tighter, the cold concrete beneath them grounding him in the only thing that mattered now. They sat there like that, mother and son, two broken pieces trying to fit back together. The world moved around them. Cars, strangers, the endless churn of the city. But none of it mattered. All that mattered was the warmth of her hands, the scent of her skin, the heartbeat beneath her ribs that had once been his entire world. "I'm sorry," she whispered into his hair. "I tried so hard to find you." Luke closed his eyes, letting her voice wash over him. "It wasn't your fault." For the first time in his life, the truth wasn't something cold and sharp. It was warm and soft, fragile but real. And it was enough. As the night stretched on, they made plans. Not big ones, just enough to get through the next day. And the day after that. A shelter, a hot meal, maybe a job. The future wasn't certain, but they would face it together. Luke didn't know where they were going. But for the first time, he knew who he was. Not Randall Caldwell's heir, but Helen's son. And that was enough. The cost of freedom. The fluorescent lights inside the shelter flickered, buzzing faintly above the quiet murmurs of displaced souls trying to carve out a moment of rest in a world that had long forgotten them. The air smelled faintly of industrial soap, coffee, and something else, the faint metallic tang of hopelessness. Luke sat beside Helen on the worn cot, the mattress beneath them thin enough that the metal frame pressed uncomfortably against his legs. It was worlds away from the silk sheets and down comforters of the Caldwell penthouse. But here, in this cramped space, surrounded by strangers with haunted eyes, he felt something that had eluded him his whole life. Freedom. Helen's hands shook as they clutched the edge of the blanket draped over her thin legs. She hadn't said much since they arrived. The weight of having her son beside her after so many years was almost too much to hold. Every time her eyes drifted to him, they filled with wonder and guilt in equal measure, awe that he was real and grief over all the moments they'd lost. "Are you sure about this, baby?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it filled the silence between them. "You left everything." Luke turned to her, her face thinner than he remembered from the photograph he'd clutched in his room for years. Time had carved lines into her skin, but her eyes, those eyes, were the same. "I didn't leave everything," he said softly. "I found you." Her lip trembled. She looked away, but Luke reached over and covered her shaking hand with his own. The strength of his grip was a small comfort, one that reminded her she wasn't alone anymore. "We'll figure it out," he said, trying to inject confidence into his voice. "Together." Helen nodded, but her mind wasn't at ease. Even after all these years, she knew Randall too well. Men like him didn't allow loose ends to walk away, not without consequence. The next morning, Luke woke to the sound of low conversation outside the sleeping area. The hum of whispered plans, quiet negotiations for work, and the careful bartering of those who lived hour to hour, meal to meal. Helen was already awake, sitting at the small plastic table near the window, nursing a cup of weak shelter coffee in her hands. Luke sat beside her, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "We need a plan." Helen smiled softly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "We?" Luke frowned. "Yeah, we." She shook her head. "I'm your mother. I should be the one taking care of you." Luke exhaled slowly, frustration and love warring inside him. "That's not how it works anymore. We take care of each other." The words hung between them, and Helen finally gave a small, reluctant nod. They both knew what he was really saying. She wasn't strong enough to do this alone. Maybe she never had been. But with him beside her, maybe they stood a chance. "We'll find jobs," Luke said. "I don't care what kind. We'll start fresh." Helen's fingers curled around her cup, her knuckles pale. "He won't let you go, baby." Luke's stomach twisted at the thought of his father, the coldness in his eyes, the power in every gesture. "He doesn't own me." Helen didn't argue, but her silence was heavy with doubt. Randall Caldwell had always owned everything, including people. They started with the diner, a small place Helen remembered from years ago, when she was still Helen Caldwell. Back then, she'd gone there to escape the suffocating perfection of Randall's world, sipping black coffee and talking to the waitresses like a normal woman instead of a billionaire's carefully controlled wife. The owner, Miss Dolores, stood behind the counter with a stern look in her eye, her arms crossed over her chest. Her silver hair was pulled into a tight bun, and she squinted at Helen the way someone might squint at a stray cat wandering too close to the door. "You ever waitressed before?" Miss Dolores asked. Helen swallowed. "A long time ago." The older woman raised an eyebrow. "I'm not looking for charity cases." "I'm not a charity case," Helen said, her voice soft but firm. "I just want a chance." Miss Dolores studied her for a moment longer, then let out a sigh. "Trial shift, tomorrow, 5 a.m. Don't be late." Helen smiled, something fragile but hopeful flickering in her eyes. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Miss Dolores muttered, already turning away. Luke found work the next day too, not from a resume, not from connections, but from sheer desperation. A construction site at the edge of the city was looking for hands, and the foreman, a grizzled man named Hank, gave Luke a long, skeptical look when he showed up in sneakers and jeans. "You ever worked a day in your life, rich boy?" Hank asked, eyeing Luke up and down. "No," Luke admitted, "but I'll work harder than anyone you've got." The older man snorted but waved him toward the piles of cement bags that needed moving. By noon, Luke's hands were raw, his shoulders screamed, and his calves felt like they were on fire. But he didn't quit. Each trip across the site felt like a small rebellion, proof to himself and to his mother that he was more than the polished son of Randall Caldwell. The other workers gave him side eyes at first, expecting him to collapse or walk away. But when he didn't, the silence shifted. By the end of the day, one of them tossed him a bottle of water, and another clapped him on the back with a grunt of approval. That night, they sat together on the motel bed, eating instant noodles from styrofoam cups, the first meal they'd shared as a family in over a decade. Helen sat cross-legged, her eyes still shining with disbelief every time she looked at her son. "Did you ever wonder about me?" she asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. Luke swallowed his noodles and set the cup aside. "Every day." Helen's smile quivered. "I was afraid you'd hate me." Luke shook his head, his throat tight. "I was afraid you forgot about me." She reached over, her fingers curling around his hand, trembling slightly. "Never." They sat in silence after that, the years between them too large to fill with words, but too small to break what they'd found again. But peace was temporary. 2 days later, Luke came back from work to find Helen sitting on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped tight in her lap, her eyes wide and fearful. "There was a man here," she whispered. "He didn't say who he was, but I knew." Luke's blood ran cold. What did he want? Helen's voice shook. "He said you could come home, if you leave me." Luke's stomach twisted into knots. It was so like his father, so clinical, so clean. The offer wasn't shouted. It wasn't forced. It was delivered quietly, like a polite invitation to a funeral. "What did you say?" Luke asked, though he already knew the answer. Helen smiled, and for the first time, it wasn't a weak, fearful smile. It was the smile of the woman she had been, the woman who fought to find her son despite every wall Randall had built. "I told him my son's not for sale." Luke exhaled slowly, pride swelling in his chest despite the fear curling around his spine. "Good." But as they sat there in the silence, both of them knew Randall Caldwell wasn't done. Men like him never were. Shadows beneath the surface. The motel room's thin walls did little to muffle the noises of the world outside. A television blared somewhere down the hall, its tinny voices blending with the honking horns of early evening traffic. Luke sat at the small plastic table, flipping a battered pen between his fingers, his mind spiraling deeper into the same maze it had been trapped in for days. Helen sat on the bed across from him, folding and refolding the same sweater, one of only 3 pieces of clothing she owned. Her hands moved automatically, her mind elsewhere, eyes unfocused. They both knew why. Randall. He hadn't shown himself, not yet, but his shadow had already crept into their fragile sanctuary. Helen's voice still trembled when she told Luke about the man who came while he was at work, clean-shaven, politely dressed, with a smile so fake it could have been cut from the pages of one of Randall's corporate brochures. He hadn't raised his voice or issued threats. That wasn't Randall's style. The message was simple, offered like a handshake. Luke could come home, resume his rightful place as the heir to the Caldwell empire, as long as he left Helen behind. Luke could still see the way his mother's fingers trembled as she told him, but her voice had steadied when she said the words that mattered most. I told him no. It should have made Luke feel braver. It didn't. If anything, it only confirmed what he knew deep down. His father wasn't done. This was only the beginning. The next day at the construction site, the weight of it all settled on his shoulders, heavier than the cement bags he hauled from one end of the lot to the other. His hands were raw, the blisters breaking open under the strain, but physical pain felt like a relief compared to the storm raging in his head. Hank, the foreman, stood near the truck, his meaty arms crossed, watching Luke's every move. He'd stopped expecting the rich boy to quit after the first week, but now there was something in the way Hank's gaze lingered that made Luke uneasy. By lunch break, Luke sat on an overturned bucket, gnawing at a sandwich that tasted like cardboard. That was when Hank wandered over, his shadow falling long across the dust-covered ground. "Kid," Hank grunted, squatting beside him. "Got a question for you." Luke swallowed, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Yeah." Hank pulled a small, glossy photograph from his jacket pocket and handed it over. Luke's stomach dropped. It was a picture of Helen, sitting on the motel bed, her thin shoulders slumped in exhaustion. The angle was too close, too deliberate, taken through the motel window. Luke's hands shook as he handed it back. "Where did you get that?" Hank exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck. "Some suit came by this morning. Asked questions about you. Slipped me that and said I should tell you to go home before things get messy." Luke's breath caught in his throat. His father hadn't just found them. He was watching them. "You tell him anything." Luke's voice was tighter than he intended. Hank's expression softened, just a little. "Told him to shove it. We don't rat out our own." Luke's chest tightened with gratitude, but fear quickly replaced it. If Randall couldn't scare them out, he'd escalate. That was who his father was, a man who didn't fight battles. He ended them before they could start. When Luke got back to the motel that night, he didn't tell Helen about the photo. Her smile, tired and fragile, was the only light in the room, and he couldn't bear to put that flicker at risk. Instead, they made dinner, instant noodles again, though Helen sprinkled in the small packet of dried vegetables like they were seasoning a gourmet meal. They talked about normal things, Luke's aching muscles, Helen's trial shift at the diner, where Miss Dolores had barked orders at her all day but hadn't sent her home. It was the closest thing to peace they'd had in weeks. But Luke couldn't stop looking at the window, wondering who might be out there, watching them even now. The next attack came subtly, just like Randall preferred, invisible fingers pulling strings. Helen went to work the following morning, only to be stopped at the door by Miss Dolores herself, her mouth a thin, tight line. "Sorry, hon," Dolores said, eyes darting to the side like she couldn't quite look at Helen. "Job's filled." Helen's heart sank. "But you said." "Had someone call me. Said there were concerns about you." Dolores's voice softened slightly. "I'm sorry." Helen wanted to fight, wanted to demand to know who had poisoned her fragile chance at stability. But she already knew. There was only one person with enough power to make her disappear from even a diner's payroll. She walked back to the motel in silence, her feet moving mechanically over cracked sidewalks, her hands shoved deep into her pockets. The sun was shining, but it might as well have been pouring rain. Luke was waiting for her, already sensing the bad news before she even opened the door. What happened? Helen forced a smile, but it crumbled almost immediately. Randall. That was all she had to say. Luke slumped onto the edge of the bed, fingers threading through his hair. He's going to keep doing this, Helen said softly. Every job, every chance we get, he'll take it away. Luke's jaw clenched. Then we stop letting him. Helen frowned. What does that mean? It means, Luke said, standing, we don't hide. We fight. That night, they walked together to a small community center Helen remembered from years ago, back when she was still herself. The director was an old friend, someone who'd known Helen before Randall transformed her life into a gilded cage. The director, a wiry man named Marcus, met them at the door. His brow lifted when he saw her, but there was warmth in his voice when he said her name. Helen Moore, he said, as if testing how it fit after all these years. I thought we lost you. I almost was, Helen said softly. They sat together in his cramped office, the walls lined with faded photographs of neighborhood block parties and youth outreach programs. Marcus leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. I know Randall Caldwell's tactics, Marcus said, his voice heavy with experience. He doesn't just take, he erases. Luke's stomach nodded. That was exactly what his father had done. Erased Helen from their lives, from the world, from the future. But if you're willing to make noise, Marcus continued, there are ways to fight back. Helen's fingers twisted in her lap. What kind of noise? Marcus's smile was faint but fierce. The kind that money hates. Public noise. The next morning, Luke stood in front of a camera for the first time in his life, not as the son of Randall Caldwell, but as Luke Moore, the boy who found his mother sleeping on the street. The local news reporter, a woman named Brianna with sharp eyes and a kind voice, asked him to start from the beginning. He told everything, from the night he found Helen to the confrontation in the penthouse. He didn't hide his name, didn't protect his father. Every lie Randall had told, every life he had destroyed. Luke laid it bare. Helen sat beside him, her hand trembling in his. When it was her turn, her voice shook, but she spoke anyway. About the accident, the memory loss, the letters that never reached Luke, the security guards who called her a nuisance, the threats, the silence, the years she spent hoping. By the time the interview ended, Helen's eyes were red, but her spine was straighter than it had been in years. We're not hiding anymore, Luke said into the camera. If Randall Caldwell wants to take us down, he'll have to do it where everyone can see. That night, the video went viral. The heir to a billion-dollar empire standing beside his homeless mother, calling out his own father. Randall didn't own silence anymore. The world was listening. A house of lies crumbles. The morning after the video aired, Luke woke to the buzzing of Helen's borrowed flip phone, the cheap prepaid kind they'd picked up at a corner store when they first left the shelter. The little screen lit up with unknown caller, and for a long second, neither of them moved. Helen sat at the edge of the bed, clutching the phone in both hands as though it might shatter as she answered. Her fingers hovered, shaking, until Luke gently covered her hand with his own. Answer it, he said softly. Helen took a breath that shook her entire body, then flipped the phone open. Hello. There was silence on the other end, thick and deliberate. Then, a familiar voice, cold and unyielding. Enjoying your little performance. Helen's breath caught in her throat. She knew that voice better than her own. Randall. Luke sat up straighter at the name, his jaw tightening, but Helen raised a hand. A silent plea to let her handle this. Exposing yourself like that, Randall continued, his voice eerily calm. Dragging my son into your mess. That was a mistake. Helen gripped the phone so tightly her knuckles went white. He's not your son, she whispered. He's ours. Not anymore, Randall said. He made his choice, And now, so have I. The call ended with a soft click, but the threat lingered in the air, curling like smoke. Luke stared at the phone as Helen placed it gently on the nightstand, her hands trembling. "He's scared," she said softly. Luke frowned. "He doesn't get scared." Helen shook her head, the faintest glimmer of a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "No, but his reputation does." The fallout was immediate. The Morning Herald, the same paper that once fawned over Randall Caldwell's business acumen and philanthropic generosity, had shifted tone overnight. Heir to Caldwell empire reunites with homeless mother. Family scandal exposed. Every headline was another crack in the marble facade. Randall Caldwell's missing wife found living on streets. What happened to Helen Caldwell? Billionaire's secrets exposed by his own son. Helen's photo, a grainy screenshot from the interview, was splashed across websites and social media feeds, her weathered face and tired eyes staring out at the world. But this time, they weren't eyes of a faceless homeless woman. They were the eyes of a mother. Helen's hand shook as she scrolled through the headlines on Luke's phone, her breath hitching with every new headline. "I'm sorry," Luke said, his voice soft. "I didn't mean to make you a spectacle." Helen shook her head, her eyes misty but resolute. "Baby, I spent years trying to be heard. Now finally, someone's listening." But Randall didn't go down quietly. By midday, his army of lawyers was already working overtime, spinning stories, drafting statements, and sowing doubt wherever they could. Helen Caldwell voluntarily left the family after severe mental health struggles. Luke Caldwell has been manipulated by a woman with a history of instability. The Caldwell Foundation remains committed to helping the homeless, including Helen. The last line made Helen's stomach churn with a sick kind of irony. "They're going to paint me as crazy," she whispered, her voice flat with resignation. Luke paced the narrow motel room, his hands buried in his hair. "They can't do that." People saw the interview. Helen's smile was faint and sad. People see what money tells them to see. By nightfall, the first hit came. The motel manager, a wiry man with a greasy comb-over, knocked on their door, his eyes skittering everywhere except their faces. "Got a call," he muttered. "Somebody's offering to buy out the whole floor. Can't turn that kind of money down." Luke's fists clenched at his sides. "How much time do we have?" The manager shifted uncomfortably. "They're sending movers tomorrow." "Movers?" Helen's voice rose, panic threading through her words. "We don't have anything." The manager shrugged, already turning away. "Guess they just want to make sure you're out." They packed what little they had into Helen's old duffel bag, the zipper struggling to close around the donated clothes and thrift store blankets. Helen's hands trembled as she folded the photograph, the only picture she had of her and baby Luke, into a tattered envelope and tucked it deep inside. Luke slung the bag over his shoulder, turning to his mother with a resolute set to his jaw. "We're not running." Helen's smile was thin, but her pride was evident. "We don't have to." The next morning, they returned to the community center, where Marcus stood waiting with a small team of volunteers. Flyers were stacked on a folding table, the bold headline catching Luke's eye. Who is Helen Caldwell? And why has Randall Caldwell spent years hiding her? Helen froze at the sight of her name in black and white, her hands fluttering nervously at her sides. "I didn't think." "We need to control the story," Marcus said firmly. "Your story, before they rewrite it." The flyers were distributed across the neighborhood. At bus stops, in coffee shops, taped to lampposts. They told the story not of a scandal, but of a woman erased by power and a son who found her against all odds. Luke and Helen walked side by side, handing out flyers to anyone who would take one. Some glanced at the papers and tossed them aside. Others frowned, recognizing the Caldwell name. A few paused, their curiosity piqued. By afternoon, the community center's small courtyard was packed with reporters, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. Luke stood beside Helen, his hand firmly around hers, as they faced the swarm together. "I'm not a runaway," Luke said, his voice steady. "I didn't leave because I wanted to rebel. I left because I found out my father has been lying to me my entire life." Helen squeezed his hand, her voice soft but clear when she spoke. "I didn't disappear. I was pushed out. I was erased. But I'm still here." The questions flew fast and sharp. About the accident, about Randall's influence, about Helen's years on the street. Luke answered what he could, and when Helen's voice faltered, he stepped in, refusing to let her bear the weight alone. Somewhere across the city, high above the chaos, Randall Caldwell stood at his office window, watching the live broadcast on the sleek television mounted to the wall. His jaw was tight, his fingers gripping the edge of his desk. The boy, his son, stood not as the hero Randall had molded, but as something far more dangerous. A boy who had nothing left to lose. Randall's phone buzzed, and without looking, he answered. "We should move forward," came the voice of his lead attorney. Randall's smile was thin and sharp. "Do it." The lawsuit arrived that night. Delivered by courier, thick with legal jargon and threats dressed up as formal demands. Randall was suing Helen for defamation, seeking millions in damages. The message was clear: disappear again, or be crushed publicly and financially. Helen's hands trembled as she held the papers, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "I can't fight this." Luke took the papers from her, flipping through them with growing fury. "We're not fighting it alone." That night, they went back to the community center. Marcus had already called in reinforcements, a nonprofit legal team specializing in cases just like Helen's. They worked through the night, drafting their response, turning the lawsuit into a weapon of its own. By morning, Helen Caldwell's countersuit was already splashed across the news. For wrongful imprisonment, emotional abuse, and the systematic destruction of her life. Randall had started the war. But Helen and Luke, together, were ready to finish it. What love leaves behind. The polished courtroom smelled of varnish and cold air. Its grandeur wasn't far off from the luxury Luke had grown up with. Dark wood paneling, heavy brass fixtures, and the quiet menace of wealth shaping every corner. But this wasn't a boardroom where Randall Caldwell's voice was law. This was a public courtroom, a space where the truth, however inconvenient, would be heard. Helen sat beside Luke at the defendant's table, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her fingers twisting together as though she were braiding invisible threads. Her clothes were borrowed from a neighbor at the shelter, a simple navy blouse and slacks a size too big, but pressed with care. Her hair, no longer matted from the streets, was combed back into a low bun. To Luke, she looked regal. To Helen, she felt like a trespasser in someone else's life. On the opposite side of the room sat Randall Caldwell. His suit was the same immaculate shade of charcoal he'd worn for decades, his tie a perfect Windsor knot, and his expression blank as polished marble. But beneath the surface, Luke could see it. The twitch at the corner of his mouth, the clench of his jaw every time a reporter's camera clicked from the gallery. This was a man who lived in the shadows, whose secrets had never faced daylight. Until now. The judge, a woman with shrewd eyes and the air of someone long immune to power's theatrics, glanced at both sides before settling her gaze on Helen. "Mrs. Caldwell," she said, "your counterclaim accuses the plaintiff of orchestrating your disappearance, falsifying your death, and preventing contact with your son for over 16 years. Do you understand the gravity of these accusations?" Helen's fingers dug into her palm, but her voice didn't waver. "Yes, Your Honor." "And you intend to prove this?" Helen glanced at Luke, who gave her a small, reassuring nod. "We do." Randall's lawyer stood, his smile the perfect blend of condescending and charming. "With all due respect, Your Honor, the defendant has a long documented history of mental instability, including a period of memory loss and hospitalization. We contend that any allegations she makes are the product of confusion and delusion." Luke shot to his feet. "That's a lie." The judge raised her hand for silence, but Helen's touch on Luke's wrist was what finally made him sit. Her eyes, soft, weathered, but resolute, told him what he needed to hear. "We will do this the right way." The first piece of evidence was a medical record, one Helen had never seen until Marcus's lawyers uncovered it. It was dated only a week after her disappearance, from a private facility owned by a shell company that traced directly back to Randall. It detailed her admission under a false name, her treatment for head trauma, and most damning of all, the directive for her to be released only after an approved representative signed off on her discharge. That representative had been Randall Caldwell. The gallery murmured as the document was displayed on the screen. Helen sat frozen, her fingers white-knuckled around her pen. "Mrs. Caldwell," her lawyer asked gently, "do you recall signing yourself into this facility?" "No," she whispered. "I don't remember being admitted at all." "And when you regained fragments of your memory years later, did you attempt to contact your son?" Helen's throat worked, but she forced herself to speak. "I sent letters, called, even tried to visit his school." Her voice broke slightly. "But every time I got close, there were men. Men." Helen's fingers twisted together again. "They said they were security. They said if I didn't leave, they'd have me arrested for trespassing." "And who employed these men?" The silence was almost painful as Helen turned her head, slowly, deliberately, toward Randall. "My husband." A ripple ran through the room, reporters' pens scratching furiously against their notepads. Randall's lawyer objected, but the judge allowed it to stand. "Mrs. Caldwell, to your knowledge, was your son ever informed you were alive?" Helen's voice was barely above a whisper. "No." "And in your opinion," the lawyer continued, "why would your husband take such extreme steps to hide you from your son?" The answer came slowly, with the weight of 16 years of silence behind it. "Because I knew things," Helen said softly, "things that could have destroyed him." Randall's head snapped up for the first time, his carefully controlled mask cracking. "Would you care to elaborate?" the lawyer prompted. Helen took a shaky breath. "I knew how Randall's business was built, not just with contracts and acquisitions, but with threats and blackmail. I knew where the bodies were buried, metaphorically and otherwise. I knew the charities were fronts. The donations were cover. I knew everything." Luke's heart pounded so hard he could hear it in his ears. He had expected the cruelty, the lies, the separation. But this was something darker. His father hadn't just wanted Helen gone because she was inconvenient. He wanted her gone because she was dangerous. Randall's lawyer rose, his smile no longer quite so polished. "So you're claiming you were some sort of whistleblower?" Helen shook her head. "I was his wife. I kept his secrets because I was afraid. But when I found out I was pregnant with Luke, I told him I couldn't do it anymore. I told him I wanted out." The courtroom fell utterly silent. "And what was his response?" the lawyer asked. Helen's voice was so quiet it was almost a breath. "He said if I left, I'd never see my son again." Randall stood abruptly. "This is absurd." The judge's gavel cracked. "Mr. Caldwell, you will sit down." For the first time in Luke's life, he saw something rare in his father's eyes. Not control, not power, but fear, and it was intoxicating. The trial lasted 2 more days, but the momentum had already shifted. Former employees of Randall's came forward, emboldened by Helen and Luke's courage. They testified about destroyed files, off-the-books accounts, and quiet payoffs to anyone who asked too many questions. The final blow came from Helen herself, a small leather-bound journal she had kept in secret before her disappearance. Inside were notes, account numbers, dates, names, a breadcrumb trail leading straight into the dark heart of the Caldwell empire. By the end, Randall's face was a mask of cold fury, his lawyers barely able to contain the bleeding. They settled the defamation suit out of court, not for millions, but for silence. And Helen refused. The cameras were waiting outside the courthouse when Helen and Luke stepped into the sunlight. Reporters shouted questions, microphones thrust toward them. But Helen only smiled, tired but unbowed. "We're not hiding anymore," she said softly, and Luke knew she wasn't just talking about the cameras. That night, they stood together on the small balcony of the modest apartment they'd been offered through a survivors' housing program. It wasn't luxury, but it was theirs. No locks hidden in gold, no walls built to keep the truth out. Helen held the photograph of baby Luke in her hands, her fingers tracing the worn edges. "Are you okay?" Luke asked. Helen looked at him, and for the first time, her smile reached her eyes. "I am now." Luke stepped closer, his arm wrapping around her thin shoulders. They stood in silence, mother and son, no longer separated by lies or wealth or power. The city stretched before them, loud and bright and messy, but for the first time, they weren't just passing through it. They belonged to it, to themselves, to each other, and that was enough.